Amikam Nachmani. He is a full professor of political science at Ilan University and former head of the Department of Political Science at the university. He specializes in the study of modern Turkey and Greece, as well as the study of Europe's Muslim minorities. His most recent book is entitled Yaakov Talmon, Combining Histories and Presents. Please.
Well, good evening. Thank you for the invitation to be here. First, let me compliment Uriya for his rare academic achievement, 3 books at a time. I envy you, Uriya. I just congratulated Professor Yaakov Shavit for the achievement of Uriya, and I said the tree did not fall far from the apple, and not the other way around. So he corrected me and said the tree did not fall far from 2 apples. Okay. Now, I will try to show both sides of the picture. And I want to share with you 4 examples that I encountered during the mid and late 2000s while carrying out a research on Europe and its Muslim minorities, published later by this name in England. Among other things, these 4 encounters had to do with questions that I posed or with questions that were posed to me. Sometimes these questions merited me with replies like, are you really a professor in a university? Are you really Israeli? Are you really Jewish? We expected more intelligence questions from you. How come you ask such ridiculous questions? Bear in mind that you are Jewish and Israeli. Incidentally, these last compliments were given to me when I asked the directors of Muslim organizations in Berlin a so-called naive question like, are there any chances that you will be fully accepted in Europe, that there will be no more ghettoization, that there will be no more parallel societies, that you will integrate? In a moment, I will come back to these questions. Eventually, these 4 examples, as well as other examples, served me with a trigger to investigate the impact of Jewish European histories on European Muslim presence. Together, these histories and presence form the Europeans, Muslim migrants, Jewish triangle. Coming to the first encounter or first example, German Jews and World War II. I spent 3 days in Berlin interviewing the directors of Muslim and Turkish organizations. At the end of these 3 days, I asked the aforementioned naive questions, so-called, why don't you integrate, etc., etc. You remember that their reply was that they expected more intelligent and less ridiculous questions from me, etc. And then came their reply. And the reply was like this. Tell me, please, German Jews were more German than the Germans, isn't it? Did it help them? It didn't. So why bother integrating? Why bother learning the German language? Okay. Now, there are those who interpret the fate of German Jewry as a warning to Muslim migrants. More specifically, it serves as a warning for Muslim migrants not to be fooled and not to believe that Europeans will be satisfied and accept them when the migrants integrate or even assimilate. They will always remain foreigners. Some Muslim migrants perceive therefore a threat to their future in Europe and see the German Jewry example as a reason to focus on their own culture, to build their own mini-sending countries within the receiving countries, and to live and pursue a process that is presently perceived and defined as ghettoization, parallel societies, dish, satellite cities, etc. Now, so why bother attempting to integrate? I should stick to ghettoization. Nothing will help me if I integrate. See the German Jews example. Okay. Now, Muslim sources maintain that World War II Jewish Holocaust is not the only modern era genocide example. See the Bosnians in the 1990s, they say. And mind you, Bosnian Muslims are Europeans. They are no foreigners, and there are no immigrants. That is to say, you could integrate as much as possible. At the end of the day, you will remain foreigner. Okay. Now, there is no reason that you should know the name of Latifa ibn Zaidan. The name should not be familiar to you. But she is the mother of the French paratrooper, Master Sergeant Imad ibn Zaidan, who was murdered in Toulouse in March 2012 by the French Muslim jihadist Mohamed Merah. In the funeral, when the coffin was lowered, Latifa ibn Zaidan cried that by encouraging her son to join a French military commando unit and fight for France, occasionally fighting fellow Muslims in Afghanistan, so she said it is impossible to integrate more than I did. And she continued, the word integration is a lie, because you could integrate as much as you wish, but the moment you have an immigrant's name, another color, or another accent, you will always remain different. The second example, indeed a bizarre, if not a weird example, is that the Jews are to be blamed for the fact that there are so many Muslims in Europe. In one of my interviews of right-wing French youth, I was asked, you know, Mr. Nachmani, why there are so many Muslims in Europe? Excuse me for talking myself about a third person. So you know, Mr. Nachmani, why there are so Muslims in Europe? The answer, because of you, because of the Jews. And I said, how come? And the reply was, apparently, Europe's present-day guilty conscience has become oversensitive in response to the atrocities that the continent inflicted on its Jews in World War II. So Europe, which was extremely intolerant of its first other, namely the Jew, is now forced to demonstrate politically correct behavior and to exhibit tolerance towards Muslim migrants. So the Holocaust, so the argument goes, produced European political correctness, which eventually resulted in the admission and acceptance of millions of Muslim migrants, and the creation of a so-called a multicultural Europe. Better to say, a community of communities with not much connection between them. Indeed, as I did not find much connection between immigrants and Europeans. Young Asians in London, i.e. Pakistanis, complained that the first time that they see a white person, and by the way, later on I'll come, imagine white sounds very colonial. I'm not sure that the color of the skin of many Muslims is darker than that of many Europeans, but never mind. So young Asians in London, i.e. Pakistanis, complained that the first time that they see a white person is at the age of 15. Now, in the early 2000s, a British committee wrote the following report, Community Cohesion Report. I'll give you two examples for this report. They entered a mixed class in London, and they asked the pupils, they were 12 years old, something like this, tell me, girl, where are you from? And she said, I come from Bangladesh. And you, girl, I come from Pakistan. And you, I come from Syria or Egypt. Then they approached, so the reports, right? Then they approached a white girl, i.e. a British girl, and asked them, girl, where are you from? And she said, I come from nowhere. Okay, I'm not going to bother you with the fuss that this reply produced, and I'll go to one paragraph of the committee report. The committee report was Community Cohesion Report Team, okay? And the report goes like this. A Muslim of Pakistani origin summed this up for us, says the committee. When I leave this meeting with you, I will go home and not see another white face until I come back here next year. Similarly, a young man from a white council estate said, I never met anyone of this estate who wasn't like us from around here. There is little wonder that the ignorance about each other's communities can easily grow into fear, etc., etc. The Guardian newspaper, by the way, I leave the report now, but I go to the Guardian newspaper. And the Guardian newspaper reported about attempts to bridge the gap between all Asians and all whites in the city of Bradford in England. They have never met each other before the bridging efforts that were made. And so this is the Guardian report about it. Today, cultural segregation in Bradford is so profound that the local education authority has started busing children from all Asian schools to all white schools, and vice versa. I traveled, so writes the reporter, I traveled with a group of Asian 10 years old, as they visited their white counterparts. What was it like the first time that you visited St. Anthony's, the white school? I asked one child. I was nervous, he said. Why were you nervous? Because I didn't know what they would be like. I had never met them before. You had never met white children before? No. Do you know any white children apart from those at St. Anthony's? No. And the reporter asked, could this be really Britain 2013? Now, Europe is this, I leave this newspaper. Europe is described as practically helpless when facing immigrants. The latter pose challenges to which the continent is unable to react. The reason it is explained is the Holocaust. The winners are Muslim migrants. Listen to the following. And this is criticism, the other side of the coin's criticism. European opinion leaders and elites were so affected by the Holocaust guilt and anti-racism that they recklessly celebrated diversity. This is post-Holocaust repentance, and it became a template for regulating the affairs of any minority that could be plausibly present itself as seriously aggrieved. The main beneficiaries of Europe's ideological sickness are Muslims, unquote. Now, as mentioned above, the charge against Jews is that Europe is forced to conduct politically correct behavior toward its Muslim migrants because in the past the continent exterminated its Jewry. A related meaningful question appeared in a lecture given recently in Jerusalem by the famous British novelist Howard Jacobson. And it goes like this, the title of two lectures he gave. Will Jews ever be forgiven for the Holocaust? And the second, will Jews ever be forgiven for anti-Semitism? Okay. The third example related to Europeans' restrictions against Muslim and Jewish traditions and rights, i.e. boys' circumcision, halal and kosher slaughtering, etc. Occasionally, there are European attempts to restrict various Muslim and Jewish rights and rituals. You are familiar with the controversies that revolves around issues like boys' circumcision, hijab and yarmulke head covers, kosher and halal, non-sedated or non-stunned slaughtering, etc., etc. In my interviews in Germany and Poland, I asked the Muslim reactions to these restrictions. I received interesting replies. Very prudently, Polish Muslims, one of them knew Hebrew, and in a moment you'll understand why. Very prudently, Polish Muslims, for instance, do not take part in the slaughter controversy that erupted lately in Poland. In Poland, as in other places in Europe, for instance in Germany, whenever there are issues of common interest to Muslims and Jews, Muslim communities leave the struggle to Jewish and Israeli lobbies. The reason? European authorities would find it much harder to ignore or refuse Jewish protests and requests. One of them, the one who knew Hebrew, I asked, what do you do when there are restrictions against slaughtering, non-stunned slaughtering, etc., etc.? He told me in Hebrew, אנחנו יושבים על התחת. We sit on our behind and leave the arena to Jews and Europeans. Now, I'll read two quotations that will give you the gist of it. About 2 years ago, the issue of boys' circumcision was intensively discussed in the German media, but nothing really happened. Some say the circumcision is a barbaric act. Some say that this is, i.e. tolerate circumcision, is part of the price that we ought to pay for the Holocaust. One quotation. The other goes like this. Let's face it. If Muslim leaders will argue that without circumcision there would be no Muslim life in Germany, people would say, so what? Who cares? When Jews say so, bear in mind the connotation of the Holocaust at the background, then you have an extremely forceful argument. Okay. The fourth and the last example relates directly to us, Israelis. The inclination, certainly among Israelis, but perhaps also among certain Jewish communities in the world, is to regard the issue of Europe and its Muslim migrants as something that does not concern them. On the contrary, there are typical Israeli utterances like, at long last, Europe experiences what we face and live with for so many years, and Let Europe eat what she cooked, etc. Yesterday I read in relation to the reports that German women were raped and harassed in New Year's Eve, allegedly by Middle Eastern immigrants. At long last, European women will feel what our women feel for so many years. These are rather superficial, if not racist, and I think also stupid reactions that do not perceive the fact that whether we like it or not, we are involved in the present European Muslim immigrants encounter. As the following example alludes, and perhaps one should not expect a different view from a Palestinian or an Arab immigrant who comes from places that most probably have seen conflicts at war with Israel. The quotation describes a meeting between a Muslim activist in Berlin and an Israeli diplomat in Berlin as well. Said the Muslim activist, "I owe you nothing. My grandfather did not kill your grandfather. If there has been any violent contact between them, perhaps it was your grandfather who killed my grandfather." Unquote. The situation becomes even more perplexed and predictions about future Jewish-Muslim-European relations more uncertain when Muslim and Arab immigrants are elected to public and leadership positions in European countries. This scenario is not hypothetical or imaginary. A top candidate to succeed the current mayor of Berlin in the December 2014 elections was a Palestinian-born immigrant. This bears direct impact on us Israelis and on Israel's foreign relations. In its foreign relations, Israel holds two main assets. The perception that Israeli and Jewish lobbying in the US is extremely affected, that Jews and Israelis have the capacity to change US policy in their favor. Hence, whoever wants to have good relations with Washington should first make a stop in Jerusalem. Okay, this is one thing. The other asset relates to the Holocaust. There is no need to elaborate on this topic. Suffice it to say that it is not rare to find nowadays Muslims take public positions in the continent and that are elected to governmental jobs, become members of parliaments, etc. None of them suffer from the Holocaust syndrome, i.e. from a guilty conscience. Their grandfather did not exterminate Jews in Auschwitz. More so, there are already European constituencies where Muslim voters demand from their white parliamentary representatives to change their policies so that they will be in accordance with the constituency's wishes and interests. And from the negative, we could perceive the positive. Take Great Britain, for example. There is not, you will not find the hunchback of the Holocaust. There is no Hatoteret shel HaShoah in Britain. Unlike the continent, Britain does not suffer from the Holocaust syndrome. The result, the British BDS movement against Israel is the strongest in the continent. Now, before I continue with the European Muslim migrants' Jewish triangle, just let me mention briefly two issues that seemingly have got nothing to do with the triangle. I bring these examples to show that the story of Europe and Muslim immigration is far from being simple, far from being black and white, far from being presented as good Europeans versus bad Muslims or the other way around. Just remember, Europe has got a very bad record as regards the treatment that it gave or gives to the other. And the other could be Bosnians, Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, mentally ill, etc. Now take, for example, the burqa, the niqab, and the hijab. When do we cover our faces, our heads? The surgeon in the operation ward, the cyclist while driving a motorcycle, in Halloween or in Purim, and the robber who attempts to rob a bank. Otherwise, first step in human communication, certainly so in the West, is to look at each other's face and eyes. Come on, look straight into my face or straight into my eyes is our common expression when we want to decipher one's intentions. No wonder, therefore, that the Muslim women's hijab, the burqa, the niqab, etc., all partially or wholly cover the women's face and head, cause us to regard Muslim women's attire as threatening or as symbolizing the marginalization and suppression of women. But there are those who consider the burqa, the niqab, and the hijab as a means of liberating women. It enables women to move freely in places that otherwise, because of cultural and social expectations and prohibitions, would have been out of bounds for them. Justifying veiling or face covering is explained to be to the public in a rather picturesque and ritualistic way. See the following. A person offers you 2 sweets, one in each hand. One sweet is neatly wrapped, the other is without wrapping at all. Surely you would choose the wrapped one that savors of cleanliness, is not exposed to the human and urban pollution around it, and even arouses curiosity. Choosing the wrapped sweet would cause you to feel well. You certainly did the right choice. But listen also to the following. The veil liberates women, said an expected placard waved by demonstrating British Muslims. An unexpected reaction was that of the Italian Home Secretary, who refused to ratify the law that bans women's veiling in public places, mentioning Christian heritage. Roberto Maroni, Italy's interior minister, refused to give his approval and ratify a law against the hijab and veiling. Maroni had a unique and original reason. If the Virgin Mary appears wearing a veil on her pictures, how can you ask me to sign a hijab ban law? Now, Muslim theologians furnish us with another favorable example pertaining to the body covered and head covered and head scarfed women, Muslim women. These theologians consider the veiling of Muslim women as a kind of passive but effective Muslim missionary activity, soft, quiet, and silent dawah, in comparison to active debates or vocal preaching. The veiled women radiate decency, restraint, dignity, the opposite of Western female promiscuousness. And promiscuous indeed are Western women, so-called. See Dr. Mahmoud Zahar, co-founder of Hamas and foreign minister of Hamas Gaza government, who blamed Western women for making fool of their husbands. And I quote, "We are the ones who respect women and honor women. Not you, the West. You have got no religion. You are secular. You do not live like human beings. You do not even live like animals. You accept homosexuality. And now you criticize us? You use your women as an animal. She has one husband and hundreds of thousands of boyfriends. Because of the way you respect women, you don't know who is the father of your sons." So these veiled women are Muslim symbols, okay? And this is something to be copied, etc., etc. For lack of time, I will continue. But a unique reaction specified the happiness of being liberated of hijabbed women. More specifically, the veil determines whether women are treated as sex objects or respected persons. The veil forces men to engage with us intellectually rather than judge us by our attractiveness, one of them says. It is Western women who are slaves to fashion, etc., etc. I had a flight from London to New York. We sat in the gate in Heathrow Airport. By me sat a totally covered Muslim woman. She said that the burqa causes men to talk to her, the burqa causes men who talk to her to refer to her personality rather than to her sexuality. Okay. The second example relates to the assassination of Theo van Gogh in November 2004. Theo van Gogh, a playwright, dramatist, and film producer, spoke out, insulted and acted against Muslims and against minorities. It could be Jews or could be Muslims, etc., etc. In the late 1990s, Van Gogh started to pick on Muslims and find fault with Islam. He was blamed for being a free speech fundamentalist, etc., etc. He was blamed for abusing his right to free speech. Van Gogh caused widespread resentment in the Muslim community by consistently referring to them as, and I apologize, but I quote here, as geitenneckers, those who have intercourse with goats. Van Gogh expressed contempt toward the Quran. To the Prophet he referred as a pedophile because Muhammad married 9-year-old Aisha. He broadcast and publicized his ideas, expressed them in theater plays, in television, radio, newspapers, and films. Reportedly, in his plays, Van Gogh staged topless women who had women humiliated verses from the Quran attached to their breasts. In 2004, Van Gogh, November 2004, Van Gogh was murdered. Okay, in the 21st century in Europe, a person is not supposed to be murdered for his views and ideas, radical and extreme as they be. But whoever hates one minority, usually hates another minority as well. Indeed, Van Gogh had incurred, okay, 5 minutes here, fine. Okay, but Van Gogh had, whoever hates one minority usually hates other minorities as well. Indeed, Van Gogh had incurred the wrath of the Jewish Dutch community earlier by making comments about the smell of caramel when he smells presumably unique to diabetic old Jews, stating that today they are burning only diabetic Jews. When you burn sugar, you produce the smell of caramel. When the Dutch Jewish historian Evelyn Gantz criticized Van Gogh, his reaction was, and I apologize, but I quote, "I suspect that Professor Gantz gets wet dreams by being fucked by Dr. Mengele." Okay, I should go and continue. So my research focuses on the use of recent and past history, or both sides, European and Muslim immigrants, when describing present and future relations between the European majority and Muslim minority. You know what? Because of lack of time, I will continue in one and just come to okay. I'll come to education, schooling, and the curriculum battleground. The educational arena is the battleground between nationalism, i.e. the state, and ethnicity. By the way, you have now the state of Israel that wants to introduce some core studies, limudei liba, into the Chevra Haredit, into the Haredi community, and imagine the controversy. Now, the school curriculum is a bone of contention between Muslim immigrants and the European state. The weird combination of a Muslim African pupil and Gaelic French history is emblematic of this conflict. In history lessons in French elementary schools, they continue to talk about our Gaelic forefathers. How is a boy who was born in France to parents who came from Senegal, Algeria, or Morocco expected to react when he is told about the Gaelic forefathers? Okay? Now, really, before concluding, I just want to mention one point. And the point goes like this. When you come to Europe and you ignore something like the Holocaust, you ignore something which is very central concerning European identity. Okay, bear in mind this point, because I think this is one of the most important points that nowadays you have in the curriculum of European schools and young Muslim students who study there. Now, in conclusion, and the conclusion goes directly against what I've just said. Does proximity brings contempt, or perhaps proximity brings compromise, or something like this? The conclusions of the Pew Global Attitude Project pertaining to the relations between Europe, the West, and the Muslim world found that a real divide exists between Western and Muslim peoples. However, the same project detected surprising positive changes in views and more optimistic attitudes, specifically among Muslims living in Europe. So in comparison to Muslims living in Arab and Muslim countries, there are different outcomes for the research concerning Muslims who live in Europe. This in comparison to Muslims who live in Muslims and Arab countries. Muslims who reside in Europe, their views of Jews are less hostile than among their counterparts in the Middle East and other Muslim countries. So our last quotation that goes against much of the material and events shown in our work and in Charlie Hebdo and in Bataclan Theater, etc., etc. So our last quotation ends our essay with a small but good reason to be more hopeful about the future. European Muslims hold more temperate views of the West than do Muslims in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Muslims in Great Britain, France, Germany, and Spain have more positive views of Westerners than do Muslims in the Middle East and Asia. They largely hold positive views toward Christians and have fewer negative views of Jews than do Muslims in the Middle East and Asia. Their attitudes and the general populations in the host countries suggest that exposure may lead to improved understanding. Let me just really read 3 sentences, and by this I conclude. And the sentences were part of mottos that were put in various academic works that dealt with the issue of Muslims in Europe. Some of them even might sound horrifying to our ears, but since they were published, I allow myself to repeat them. One of them from 2011, as anti-Semitism was a unifying factor for far-right parties in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s and 40s, Islamophobia has become the unifying factor in the early decades of the 21st century. The second one, I allow myself to quote it, although it is not so easy to hear it. Go to any European and tell him 1,000 Jews are coming into his city, and he will say, great, and in what area they are going to invest. Now, change Jew to Muslim, and the response would be crap, and what area they are going to destroy. And the third and the last, why is it criminal offense to deny the Holocaust, while simultaneously it is permissible for Charlie Hebdo to offend Muslims and to draw cartoons of the Prophet? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will go now to the next session. 10 minutes, yeah.